The wagon axle broke before the first snowflake fell. That was the warning Clara Bennett trusted most. The sky over northern Wyoming had turned the dull color of iron, but the prairie around her was strangely still. No grass moved, no bird crossed above the ridge. Even Molly, the bay mule that had pulled Clara nearly 200 miles, planted all 4 hooves in the frozen earth and refused to move. Clara stood beside the crooked wagon and watched the northern horizon disappear. A dark wall was spreading across it. Fast, she was 34 years old, alone, and nearly 40 miles from the nearest settlement. Everything she still owned was packed behind her beneath a torn canvas cover. The wagon gave another wooden crack. The left side dropped several inches. Clara did not curse. She pulled off one glove, placed 2 fingers against Molly's neck, and felt the mule's muscles twitch beneath the coarse winter coat. Then the first wind touched Clara's cheek. It was sharp enough to make her eye water. If you've ever wondered how little time a person may have to save a life, stay with Clara through this night. She climbed onto the wagon seat and searched the land. No ranch, no smoke, no timber thick enough to stop a northern wind, only pale grass, broken ridges, and long shelves of reddish stone rising from the empty country. 3 months earlier, Clara had owned a small supply house outside Fort Collins with her husband Samuel. Then, Samuel had gone beneath a freight horse when a bridge plank broke under the team. After the burial, unpaid notes appeared. One creditor came, then another. By October, Clara had been left with a wagon, Molly, 2 trunks, Samuel's old rifle, food for several weeks, and $38 sewn inside the lining of her coat. Her younger sister lived near Buffalo, Wyoming, so Clara went north. She had crossed bad roads before. She had slept beside frozen creeks. She had repaired harness leather by lantern light. But she had never seen Molly refuse the trail. That mattered. Her father had driven freight across Colorado and Wyoming for 27 years. When Clara was a girl, he used to stop the team whenever the horses began watching the sky instead of the road. "Don't argue with an animal that has more sense than you," he would say. Clara looked at Molly again. The mule's ears remained pressed flat. Then, Clara saw the shadow. Far below the ridge, a sandstone wall curved outward over a shallow cut in the rock. It was not a deep cave. It was barely a room. But the opening faced southeast. The storm was coming from the north. Clara climbed down. She took the rifle, a coil of rope, and a small hatchet from the wagon. Then, she led Molly toward the bluff. The mule followed immediately. That told Clara enough. They crossed nearly 300 yards of frozen ground. Halfway there, loose snow began sliding across the prairie in thin white lines. Not falling. Moving sideways. Clara increased her pace. Inside the rock hollow, the wind almost vanished. She stood beneath the sandstone roof and studied the space. Solid rock behind her. Solid rock to the left. A thick shoulder of stone to the right. Dry sand beneath her boots. Only the front stood open. Clara slowly turned toward the broken wagon on the ridge. Its dark wooden box sat tilted against the white grass. Her eyes narrowed. The wagon was no longer transportation. It was lumber. She tied Molly deep inside the hollow. "Stay." The mule lowered her head. Clara ran back toward the ridge. Snow struck her face before she reached the wagon. The wind had strengthened enough to push against her skirt. She stripped the wagon quickly. Blankets, food sack, tool chest, lantern, kerosene, canvas, rope. She threw everything onto the frozen ground. Then, she attacked the wagon itself. The damaged wheel refused to come free. Clara hammered at the pin until the metal shifted. Her glove slipped. The hammer struck the side of her thumb. She bent over her hand, breathing through her teeth. A line of blood appeared beside the nail. She wrapped the thumb in cloth and continued. The second wheel came loose, then the front frame, then the broken running gear. What remained was the heavy wooden wagon box. Clara tied her rope around it. She looped the other end across her shoulders. She leaned forward. Nothing moved. The wind pushed harder. Snow began sticking to the back of her coat. Clara lowered her body until the rope cut beneath her arms. She drove both boots into the earth. The wagon box scraped forward 6 inches. She stopped, drew 2 breaths, pulled again. Another foot. She began dragging it downhill. The wood tore a dark path through the fresh snow behind her. 20 yards. 40. Clara's breathing turned rough. Her injured hand stained the rope. At 70 yards, her right boot slipped. She struck the ground on one knee. The wagon box stopped behind her. For several seconds, Clara remained there, head lowered, snow collecting across her shoulders. Then she looked toward the sandstone hollow. Molly stood inside the opening. Waiting, Clara pushed herself upright. Out there, survival was not about defeating winter. It was about keeping one useful thing between a warm body and the wind. She pulled again. By the time she reached the bluff, daylight was fading. Clara dragged the wagon box sideways across the opening. It covered most of it. Most was not enough. Wind rushed through the gaps on both sides. She stretched the torn wagon canvas across the upper opening and pinned it beneath stones. Then she gathered frozen grass from the hillside, armful after armful. She packed it between the wagon boards and sandstone. Where cold air touched the back of her hand, she added more. Where the air stayed still, she moved on. Snow now struck the outer wall so hard it sounded like dry grain thrown against wood. Molly backed deeper into the hollow. Clara sealed the final gap near the ground. Then the blizzard arrived in full force. The wind struck the sandstone bluff with enough power to shake loose dust from the ceiling. The canvas snapped tight. The wagon wall groaned. Clara dropped beside it and pressed both hands against the boards. For one long second, the whole wall bent inward. Then it moved back. It held. Clara stayed there listening. Another blast came. The grass stuffing trembled. Nothing opened. She turned toward Molly. Warm breath rose from the mule's nose. Clara's own breath hung pale in front of her face. She had a roof. She had walls. She had food. She had one animal giving off heat. And she had survived the first attack of the storm. Then, something struck the outside of the wagon wall. Clara froze. Not wind. Not snow. A heavy blow came again. Lower this time. Something was moving outside. Clara kept both palms against the wagon wall. Another thud struck the boards. Then a long scrape dragged across the outside. Molly lifted her head. Her ears pointed toward the entrance. Clara reached for Samuel's rifle and worked the lever slowly. The shelter had become almost completely dark. Only a thin gray line showed near the top of the canvas, where one corner had not sealed against the sandstone. She moved toward it. Another scrape passed along the wood. Clara raised herself enough to look through the narrow gap. White snow rushed sideways across the opening. Nothing else. She waited. A dark shape rolled past. Then, another. Clara lowered the rifle. Tumbleweeds, huge dry balls of prairie brush were being ripped loose and thrown against the bluff. She leaned her forehead against the wagon board. One short breath escaped her nose. Then Molly made a different sound, a low grunt. Clara turned. The mule was staring toward the upper edge of the wall. Not at the outside. At something Clara could not yet hear. She waited. The wind screamed across the stone. Snow rattled against the wagon. Then underneath all of it came something thin. A human voice. Clara straightened. The sound vanished. She moved to the gap again. "Hello?" Her own voice died almost at once. Nothing answered. Clara stepped back. A person could hear anything after hours alone in a storm. Wood cracking could sound like speech. Wind around stone could sound like crying. Then, Molly stepped toward the entrance. The mule's ears stayed forward. Clara looked at her. All right. She lifted the lantern. The kerosene reservoir was less than half full. She had planned to use it only when necessary. The shelter was already holding body heat well enough without flame. Lighting the lantern meant using fuel she might need later, but leaving it dark meant anyone outside could walk within 20 yards of the bluff and never know a shelter existed. Clara struck a match. The wick caught. Warm yellow light filled the small hollow. She covered most of the lantern with her coat and lifted one corner of the canvas. Wind shoved snow into her face. Clara raised the lamp outside. For several seconds she saw nothing. Then a figure appeared on the ridge. A man. He leaned forward against the wind with one arm wrapped around another person. Behind them came more shapes. 5, maybe 6. They were walking in the wrong direction. They would pass north of the bluff. Clara waved the lantern. The flame shook. The figures kept moving. She waved harder. One stopped. Another nearly walked into him. Clara raised the light as high as she could. The lead figure turned toward the bluff. His arm lifted. They had seen her. Clara pulled the lantern back inside. Now, she had another problem. A small light might show them where to go, but the storm could swallow it every few seconds. She searched through the pile beside her tools. A broken wagon bow lay under the canvas. Clara grabbed it. She wrapped a strip of torn cloth around one end, poured a small amount of kerosene over the cloth, and carried it to the lantern. The rag caught quickly. Orange flame curled sideways the moment she pushed it beyond the opening. Clara held the torch high. The people on the ridge changed direction. They began coming down. Slowly, one man fell to both knees. Another turned back for him. A smaller figure near the center collapsed completely. 2 people lifted the body between them and kept walking. Clara pulled away more grass from one side of the wall. The opening widened just enough for a person to squeeze through. Cold air poured inside. Molly stepped backward. Not long. Clara pushed outside. Snow reached above her ankles now. She stamped a short line of deep tracks leading from the entrance toward the descending group. Then she returned to the wall and held the torch above her head. The first traveler reached her several minutes later. He was a broad man near 60, with ice packed through his beard. His mouth moved twice before sound came. Inside? Clara nodded. One at a time. He squeezed through the opening. A woman followed. Then 2 younger men. The 5th person was a girl. No more than 14 or 15. She could barely keep her boots beneath her. The last traveler came in holding his left arm tightly against his chest. Clara sealed the entrance again. The difference was immediate. The roar dropped. 8 bodies and 1 mule now filled the hollow. Warm breath clouded the air. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. The older man sat against the stone wall. I'm Walter Hale. He pointed toward the woman beside him. My wife, Ruth. Then toward the 2 younger men. Daniel and Caleb Mercer. The taller one still had one hand resting on the girl's shoulder. That's Daniel's daughter. Annie. The injured man lifted his chin. Ben Carter. Clara gave her name. Nothing more. She opened her food bag. 2 biscuits. Dried beef, a small piece of cheese, hard bread. She divided it carefully. Ben tried to push his piece toward Annie. Clara shook her head. Eat yours. He looked at her. She needs it. So do you. Ruth quietly broke her own biscuit and handed half to Annie. The girl ate without looking up. Clara watched Ben's arm. His left shoulder sat lower than the right. The sleeve pulled strangely across the joint. She moved closer. What happened? Fell off the horse. When? Before dark. Clara touched the outside of his coat. Ben's jaw tightened. She withdrew her hand. Shoulders out. Walter looked over. You can fix it? I've seen it done. Ben gave a dry laugh. That's comforting. Clara looked straight at him. You want to keep it like that? Ben stared at her for 2 seconds. Then he sat against the wall. Do it. Walter moved behind him and locked both arms around his chest. Clara took Ben's wrist. She pulled slowly. Ben's boots dug into the sand. His breathing turned sharp. Clara rotated the arm. The joint slipped back with a wet pop. Ben's whole body went loose. He lowered his head. For several breaths he said nothing. Then he moved his fingers. Better. Clara tore a strip from the bottom of an old blanket and tied the arm against his ribs. When she finished, Walter studied her hands. The skin across her palms was split from dragging the wagon. Blood had dried along the rope marks. You built this today? Clara nodded. Walter looked toward the wagon wall. With that wreck? Most of it. He pressed his gloved hand against the packed grass between wood and stone. No wind came through. Walter slowly sat back. 26 years I've hauled freight through this country. His eyes moved around the hollow. I walked right past this bluff twice. Clara looked toward the sealed entrance. So would I, if the wagon hadn't broken. The words had barely left her mouth when Caleb Mercer raised his head. How many did you say were with your train? Walter did not answer at first. Daniel did. 25 travelers left Sheridan 3 days ago. Clara's hand stopped above the food bag. 25? Daniel nodded. We lost sight of most of them after noon. The hollow became still except for breathing. Clara looked toward the wall she had built. 6 people had found her light. That meant 18 others were still somewhere outside. Then, Annie lifted her head from Ruth's shoulder. There were tracks behind us. Everyone turned toward her. The girl swallowed. Before we came down the ridge. Daniel leaned closer. What tracks? Annie pointed toward the entrance. Someone was following our trail. A sound came from outside, not wind. 3 hard knocks struck the wagon boards. Knock, knock, knock. Clara raised one hand. Nobody moved. 3 knocks came again from the other side of the wagon wall. Slower this time. Walter reached for the rifle. Clara shook her head and moved toward the opening. Who is it? For several seconds, only wind answered. Then, a man's voice pushed through the boards. Please. Clara pulled away the packed grass. Cold air rushed across the floor. A man fell through the opening before she could catch him. He landed on both hands. Snow covered his coat from shoulders to boots. One side of his face had turned pale beneath a layer of ice. Walter dragged him farther inside while Clara sealed the wall again. The stranger lay on the sand, breathing through an open mouth. Daniel crouched beside him. Tom? The man lifted his head. Daniel's face changed. Tom Avery. Tom tried to answer. His teeth struck together too hard. Clara removed his wet outer coat and wrapped him in the last dry blanket. Where are the others? Tom looked toward Walter. His lips moved. North. Walter leaned closer. How many? Tom closed his eyes. Too many. He swallowed twice before continuing. The lead wagons kept pushing after the snow started. Hanson said there was a stage station 10 miles ahead. Walter lowered his head. There isn't. Tom nodded. I know that now. No one spoke. Clara rubbed Tom's hands through the blanket instead of placing them near direct heat. His fingers were stiff. His boots were worse. She loosened the frozen leather, but did not pull the boots completely off. Her father had once stopped a young freighter from doing exactly that beside a camp stove. Warm, frozen flesh too fast, and the damage could deepen. Clara worked carefully. Tom's breathing finally slowed. Then he looked at her. "Your light." Clara paused. Tom nodded toward the entrance. Saw it from the wash. That meant the torch had reached farther than she thought. Walter sat beside him. Who else saw it? Tom stared at the ground. I don't know. A gust slammed against the wall. Everyone looked toward the boards. The wagon shifted less than an inch. Clara pressed her hand against the seam, still sealed. Annie watched her. Can more people fit? Clara looked around. 8 adults. 1 girl. 1 mule. And now Tom. The hollow had almost no open floor left. Yes, Walter looked at her. How many? As many as come. Nobody argued. An hour passed. Maybe 2. Time had become impossible to measure. The wind rose again, until even conversation required raised voices. Tom began speaking in pieces. The travelers had separated after a wagon overturned near dusk. Some stayed with the wreck, others kept moving. 1 horse broke a leg. A family with 2 children had taken shelter beside a dry creek bank. Tom had tried to follow Daniel's group until blowing snow erased every track. He wandered until he saw Clara's torch through the storm. Walter rubbed both hands over his beard. "We can't go looking." "No," Clara said. Daniel looked toward Annie. His hand rested against the back of her coat. No one needed to explain why. Outside, a person could disappear 10 feet from the wall. Inside, they could still help anyone who reached them. Clara checked every seam again. Near the bottom right corner, cold air touched her wrist. She pulled out the loose grass and replaced it with a thicker bundle. Caleb crawled over to help. He pushed the grass deep between the wagon plank and stone. Clara tested the seam. Nothing. Caleb looked at her raw hands. "You dragged this whole box down yourself?" Clara kept working. It was downhill. Caleb stared at the heavy oak boards. "That doesn't answer the question." Clara finally looked at him. It moved. That was all she gave him. Ruth passed the water around. Each person took 1 swallow. Tom tried to refuse. Clara pushed the canteen back into his hand. "Drink." He obeyed. The air inside had become damp from breath. Frost formed along the higher rock where warm air met stone. Molly stood quietly in the deepest corner. Every few minutes, Clara touched the mule's ears and neck. Still warm. Still steady. Then, Annie began coughing. Daniel pulled her closer. The girl covered her mouth with her scarf. Clara touched the side of Annie's face. Warm skin. Not dangerous yet. She loosened the scarf around the girl's mouth so she could breathe without soaking the wool. Slow breaths. Annie nodded. Clara sat beside her. "Tell me something about that palomino you wanted." Annie looked up. "You remembered?" Clara adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "You told me." Annie stared at the lantern. "My father said a good horse could find home in weather a man couldn't." Daniel lowered his eyes. Clara saw it. She did not ask. Annie continued. "He died when I was 9. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. He was crossing a river in spring. Clara looked at the girl's boots. "Did he teach you to ride?" "Before I could reach the stirrups. Then keep your feet warm. He'd complain if you lost toes after all that work." A small breath came from Annie that almost became a laugh. Daniel looked toward Clara and nodded once. Later, when the lantern burned low, Walter crawled beside her. "We should put it out." Clara agreed. She lowered the wick. Darkness swallowed the hollow. The sounds changed immediately. Breathing, cloth shifting, Molly chewing slowly, wind grinding snow across wood. Then, a new sound came from beyond the wall. Not knocking, a long scrape. Something moved outside. Walter's hand found the rifle. Clara waited. The scrape came again. Higher. Then, a weak voice. "Help!" Clara opened the gap. 2 men stood outside. One supported the other. They fell inside together. The first had blood frozen down one side of his coat. The second could barely stand. Clara sealed the entrance. Walter recognized them both. Frank Larkin. Joe Miller. Frank nodded weakly. Joe did not. He lay on the floor with his eyes open but unfocused. Clara pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw. A pulse. Slow, she pulled her coat off and laid it across him. Walter looked around the crowded hollow. 11 people now, 1 mule. Almost no food, very little water, and the storm was still moving. Frank grabbed Walter's sleeve. There are more behind us. Walter leaned close. How far? Frank's cracked lips barely moved. Maybe half a mile. Clara looked at the sealed wall, then at the lantern. Only a thin layer of kerosene remained in the bottom, enough for one more signal. Maybe. She picked it up. Walter caught her wrist. If you light that outside, the wind may take the last fuel. Clara looked at him. Then she looked toward Annie, Joe, Tom, and the others packed shoulder to shoulder against the rock. Another voice rose somewhere beyond the storm, so faint it could have been 50 yards away. Or 500. Clara opened the lantern and reached for the matches. The match burned between Clara's fingers. Walter still held her wrist. Outside, the voice disappeared beneath the wind. Clara looked at the small flame, then at the lantern. Let go. Walter did. She touched the match to the wick. The last kerosene caught. Clara opened the smallest possible gap in the wall and pushed the lantern through. Wind threw snow across her face. She lifted the light. Once, twice, 3 slow swings toward the open prairie. Then the flame bent low. Clara pulled the lantern inside before the wind killed it. They waited. Nothing came. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Walter kept one ear against the wagon boards. Daniel held Annie beneath both arms. Joe Miller had stopped shaking. Clara checked him twice and found his pulse still moving beneath her fingertips. The lantern went dark. No one spoke about the voice again. There was nothing left they could spend on it. The storm began weakening sometime before dawn. Clara noticed the change first through the wagon wall. For hours, snow had struck the boards without stopping. Now there were spaces between the gusts. 3 seconds. 5, then 10. Caleb raised his head. It's ending. Clara shook hers. Not yet. Walter looked at her. How do you know? Clara rested a hand against Molly's neck. The mule was still standing with her ears turned backward. We wait until she tells us. Nobody laughed. An hour later, Molly moved. She lifted her head, stepped away from the rear wall, and walked toward the entrance. Her ears came forward. Her breathing stayed slow. Clara stood. Now, Walter helped her remove the frozen grass. The canvas had become stiff enough to hold its own shape. They broke ice from the edges with Clara's hatchet. Then, Walter, Caleb, and Daniel put their shoulders against the wagon box. It resisted at first. They pushed again. The wood tipped outward. Morning entered the hollow. Clara stepped through. Snow reached almost to her knees. The prairie from the night before was gone. Every wagon track had vanished. Every low bush had disappeared beneath smooth white drifts. The sandstone ridges stood under a clear blue sky. No wind touched Clara's face. Behind her, people began crawling from the shelter one by one. Walter, Ruth, Daniel carrying Annie. Caleb, Ben with his arm still tied against his chest. Tom, Frank, Joe between 2 men. The survivors stood without speaking. Then Walter looked north. Clara followed his eyes. Something dark showed through the snow on the ridge. A wheel. Farther beyond it stood another wagon, half buried. Then another. Daniel took 2 steps forward and stopped. The white country was scattered with broken shapes. Clara counted until she reached 9 wagons. Then she stopped. Annie pressed her face against her father's coat. Walter removed his hat. Nobody walked toward the ridge. They were too weak. And some things did not need to be seen from close range. They gathered what remained. Clara packed her tools onto Molly. Ruth wrapped Annie in the driest blanket. Walter broke a long wagon bow loose and used it to test the snow ahead. They started south. Every 100 yards, someone had to stop. Joe could walk only with help. Ben's shoulder had swollen beneath the sling. Clara's palms opened again beneath her gloves, leaving dark stains inside the leather. Still they moved. Near midday, Molly stopped. Her ears lifted. Clara heard it seconds later. Bells, small harness bells. Walter turned toward the southern rise. 2 horsemen appeared against the sky. A third followed with a pack mule. The lead rider saw the group and shouted. He drove his horse down the slope toward them. His name was Deputy Nathan Cole from Buffalo. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. His eyes moved across the survivors. "How many?" Walter answered. 11 came out of the rocks. Cole stared at them. 11? Clara pointed behind her. "There's a shelter under the sandstone bluff." The deputy looked north. His jaw tightened. "We've been riding since first light." He removed 1 glove. "We found 19 travelers dead along the north trail." No one answered. The number remained between them. 19. Clara turned toward the distant ridge. From here she could no longer see the little hollow. Only sandstone. Only snow. Cole looked at the torn canvas tied across Molly's pack. "You all spent the night in a cave?" Walter shook his head. "Not exactly." He pointed at Clara. She found 3 rock walls. Then he pointed toward the ridge and dragged the 4th one down there. Deputy Cole looked at Clara's hands, the torn gloves, the dried blood. He looked back toward the buried wagons. He did not ask another question. The rescue riders had coffee, blankets, bread, and 2 extra horses. Joe was placed on one. Annie rode the other with Ruth behind her. The rest walked south. By late afternoon, chimney smoke appeared across the valley. Buffalo. Clara stopped on the rise. Months of travel had reduced everything she owned to what Molly carried on her back. A toolbox. 2 blankets. A rifle. A little food. $38 sewn inside her coat. Behind her lay a wagon that would never roll again. Ahead stood the house of the sister she had not seen in 7 years. Clara continued walking. Her sister, Margaret Bennett, reached her before Clara reached the first building. Margaret ran through the snow without a coat buttoned. She stopped directly in front of Clara. For 1 second, neither woman moved. Then, Margaret put both arms around her. Clara's hands remained at her sides. Her fingers opened. The rope cuts pulled. Then, her arms rose around her sister. Her face disappeared against Margaret's shoulder. That evening, the survivors were spread through several homes in Buffalo. Ben's shoulder was properly wrapped. Joe woke beside a hot stove. Annie slept beneath 3 quilts. Molly stood in Margaret's barn with hay up to her knees. Clara sat alone at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed. Her torn gloves rested beside a lamp. She turned them over. The palms were nearly worn through. A small piece of sandstone had lodged inside one cuff. Clara removed it and placed it beside the lamp. Months later, travelers passing that same ridge found the wrecked wagon box still leaning beside the rock shelter. Someone had repaired the canvas. Someone else had stacked more stone along the opening. By the following winter, a wooden sign had been nailed beside the entrance. No name was written on it. Only 4 words. Storm shelter. Leave it ready, and whenever snow crossed that Wyoming ridge, the old wagon boards remained beneath the rock, facing the wind. If Clara's night on that ridge stayed with you, subscribe and like for more frontier stories like this one.